Okay, everybody, let's talk about intuition. Laws are only reached by non-logical methods. To make a law, one has to have an intellectual love of the subject. That's Albert Einstein. Okay, so let's talk about intuition as a way of knowing. So when I used to teach intuition in TOK 10 years ago, I would teach it as part of the emotion unit. And then about 5 years ago, the IB decided to break intuition off as its own specific area of knowledge. Way of knowing. So a simple definition of intuition is just this feeling that we get that can give us knowledge. Like, I have an intuition that this is the best career path I should take. They're very different than, say, other emotions like, say, love or hate, because they're not really reactive emotions. They don't necessarily react in the same way. So sometimes people tend to put that word intuition with that sort of aha moment that we have when suddenly a problem solution becomes apparent to us without, going through a lot of thinking processes. We just all of a sudden, aha, there's the solution. So that might also be a way to define intuition. So one example, it said that Archimedes, when he came up with the Archimedes principle, was in the bath one day. And when all of a sudden he was just lying in the bath, he came up with this idea of the Archimedes principle. And the story goes that he just sort of jumped out of the bath and started running down the street naked, yelling, "Eureka, Eureka." And he had this sort of moment of clarity. And that could be one definition of intuition. Maybe you have your own personal definition of intuition, or maybe you also have your own sort of example of when that sort of aha moment appeared to you in what you were doing. So that idea of solving problems and then all of a sudden the answer just mysteriously appearing to you is really not a good definition of how intuition might work. Other people have defined it as kind of this sixth sense, this sort of magical ability to sort of get a hunch about something. Like, maybe you've had an intuition, as it says there, that someone's standing behind you and you turn around and there they are, right? But are intuitions actually reliable? Do they actually work? What if you turn around and there is no one there? So what I want to do is distinguish between three different types of intuition: core intuitions, subject-specific intuitions, and social intuitions. So core intuitions are fundamental intuitions about like life, the universe, yourself, like really core to your being. Obviously, subject-specific are about some specific subject, like a science intuition, or maybe intuitions in math or art or music. And then social intuitions are intuitions about other people. Like, you have an intuition that your boyfriend is being unfaithful to you or something like that. Okay, so let's dig into what this word intuition kind of means in that context. Starting with the core intuitions. So it could be argued that all of our knowledge is based on intuition. If we have a very broad definition of intuition, you can say that we rely on intuition to essentially give us all of our knowledge. So for example, in reason, we talked about those laws of thought or laws of logic, and that they were the starting point. You might remember the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle. We can't prove those laws as fundamental. Most people just accept them as an axiomatic concept, that we just accept it as a starting point. And that would be then an intuition that we just accept them. That could be an argument. If we look at perception, another important source of knowledge, how we know things because we sense it. How do we know that our senses are being reliable and that we're not dreaming right now, that you guys are still asleep? We could say, well, we have this evidence, but that appeal to evidence could be overwhelmingly basically just an intuition that what we're experiencing now is our reality and not some form of sub-reality. What about other areas of knowledge like language and emotion? Well, again, I could make arguments that intuition is a core to those. So you might remember we started this course with an example I call the why game, right? So remember, like, you're talking to like a little 4-year-old and they say, like, why is the sky blue? Well, why do we have an atmosphere? Well, why are there planets? And if they keep asking you that why question, why, eventually you get tired of answering the question and you just say, well, that's just, you have to just say that's is because it is. That's the point where you reach that axiom, that starting point, where you just accept things because that's just the way they are. And some might argue that that's the point where intuition kicks in. That's where core intuition essentially happens. That things are just intuitively obvious for that reason. Okay, so let's try a couple of these just as thought experiments. What evidence could you give to support the statement, I know I exist? You could appeal to intuition. You could say, I know I exist because I do. I know it because it's intuitive. How do I know that life is not a dream? I know I'm not in a dream right now because I have evidence of that. And the evidence is my intuition. I just know it from my core of my being. And you can see the other ones there, right? The sort of law of the excluded middle, the mathematical example, 1 + 1 = 2, the physics examples, that your friends are not androids, that, you know, the moral question of torturing people, etc. So one could make that argument that intuition is the core of our knowledge system, because although it goes up from there to things like reason and emotion and language, that at its core, intuition is an axiom or a starting point. Okay? There's this philosophical school called Romanticism, which is very much reliant on emotion, that says that both sense perception and emotion are good ways of knowing, but not as good as emotion. That in the romantic sort of philosophical position, as it says, they're literary figures rather than philosophers. What they had in common was this emphasis on emotions of making sense of the world. That, and again, this relies on intuition, that at its core, we know things because we can feel it, right? We know that we exist because we can feel it to our core, okay? This is also heavily connected often with things like religious perspectives, philosophical perspectives, and other types of very core human type emotional, intuitive perceptions. Okay, now let's flip the script. Let's criticize that. So let's look at the criticism of emotion, or sorry, excuse me, intuition as this core thing. So yeah, you could say, well, yeah, everyone thinks it's intuitively obvious, like the origin of the universe is intuitive. Can machines think? Can a mind exist without a body? Is abortion murder? All of those, we have a core intuition on it. But do we? Do we all agree that the mind can exist without a body, or that abortion is murder, or that the universe began with a Big Bang? I don't think we all do agree on that. So there isn't a core intuition that we're all feeding into from the negative side, if that were true. So again, what I'm looking at now is criticizing intuition. I'm looking at the other side of this argument. So here's 3 questions that cast doubt on the claim that intuition is a source of knowledge. If something is intuitively obvious, then everyone should agree with it, right? If you make that statement, well, I know it's true because it's intuitive. Well, if it was intuitive, everyone would agree with it. And we know that everyone doesn't agree with stuff. Could you be wrong? A really good question that everyone should always ask themselves all the time. Could I, in fact, be wrong? If something's intuitively obvious, then the answer would be no, I can't be wrong. And I don't think that's a good way to go through an intelligent sort of examination of facts, is to just assume you could never be wrong. I'm sure some of us have ran into that person who knows they're never wrong. And we all know that it's not the kind of person that you're going to take good advice from. And finally, whose intuitions should we trust? If someone tells you this is what your intuition should be, and then someone else tells you something differently, which of those should I trust? So again, we're kind of stuck in this position that intuition maybe isn't this core belief system that we think it is. Okay? So it's an interesting idea that intuition is an emotional starting point for sort of the beginnings of certain pieces of knowledge. Okay, let's look at subject-specific intuition. So let's get a little more specific now. Okay, so there's a lot of evidence that suggests that uneducated intuition should be questioned. So for example, if you wanted to know if your intuitions about a certain concept in physics were good intuitions or not good intuitions, maybe don't go ask Mr. McWilliam. His intuitions on physics may not be as strong as someone like, say, Mr. Libby. He might have a really good physics intuition. If you needed to know an intuition about mathematics, yes, Mr. Jansen Roth or Mr. LaFrance might be a good person who would have a strong subject-specific intuition, that their intuitions about a math problem I would maybe trust as more factual than someone else's intuitions about that subject area. Let's try a little test. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, bright, very much involved in social issues like disarmament, equal rights. If I gave you that piece of information that Linda, this 31-year-old, outspoken, bright, very much involved social rights person, which of these statements would you say is more intuitively to be likely true? That Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller and an active in the feminist movement? So both of them include the word bank teller, but it's in that second one that it adds an additional piece of information. Which to you is more intuitively likely? Well, it's actually more probable that the first statement is more intuitively true. Why? Because it doesn't add information. When you add more information, the probability factor of it goes down a little bit. Now, we could talk about probability in a pure mathematics way, and I can't remember if this was the class where I discussed the probability formulas. I wish they taught that again in math classes, but they don't teach probability formulas. Anyways, it doesn't have to be studied in mathematical terms. We can talk about it in philosophical terms like we're doing right now, where in your intuition, you might have actually thought the second one was more likely true, because in the description, it talked about her being involved. So, okay. But if I actually look at it from a pure logic standpoint, it's actually the first one that's still more intuitively true because it's less information. Okay, let's try another one. If I flip a coin, and it's a regular coin, nothing fancy about the coin, 6 times in a row, what's the probability of getting the following sequence of flips? Heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails. That's the first option, that if I flipped it 6 times, I'd get heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails. Or if I flipped it 6 times and got heads, 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 heads. So right now, think to yourself, and if the chat was working, I would have you guys type in the chat. Which is more intuitive? Which of those two would be more intuitively likely? Anyone want to put on their mic and hazard a guess? It might be a trick question. Okay, so the answer is it's the same. It's the same probability, okay? And that's, again, an examination of the probability formula, okay? The reality is that you have the exact same odds of getting heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails as 6 heads in a row. This is like if you play cards, what's the probability of getting a royal flush? Like an ace, king, queen, jack, 10, all in one suit, is actually the same probability of just getting any 5 random cards. It's all the same probability. Now, again, you can look at that mathematically. You got to know about things like factorials and cool math stuff like that. I love probability calculations, but the reality is our intuitions often lead us one way, which may not be accurate. But if you've studied math, you might have understood that that question about the heads, tails was actually a trick question, and it was the same probability. All right, let's do the soccer match one. There's 11 players on each side of a soccer game and a referee. So there's 22 players and one referee. So there's 23 people on a soccer field. What are the odds that 2 of those people have the exact same birthday? The answer is, again, you take that there are 364 days in a year, 365, right? 364 possible days that one person can have a different birthday than the other. So with 2 people, it's 364 over 365. And then if we add people and we multiply, if we do a probability calculation, it works out to 0.492% probability of 2 people having the same birthday. So that's low. It's a pretty low probability. Okay, here's another one. This one is not as much of a math intuition, but a physics intuition. So if any of you have studied physics, you're probably going to have a more educated intuition on this one. You're standing on a flat surface. Let's say it's a field, holding a bullet in your left hand and a loaded gun in your right hand. At the exact same time, you fire the gun and drop the bullet. So you squeeze the trigger of the gun and you drop the bullet at the exact same moment of time. Which of the 2 bullets will hit the ground first? So remember, you shoot a bullet out of the gun and you drop a bullet. So one's shooting out and will eventually touch the ground, assuming that there's nothing in the way of the bullet, right? That's why I had the flat field, like it's not going to hit something on the way. Which will hit the ground first? So your intuitions might lead you one way, but the answer is that they'll hit the ground at the exact same time, okay? And again, that might not be your intuition, but that's what the physics tells us. So only by learning more physics would it kind of train your intuition to be a little more educated in that way, okay? So this is a bit of a statement from my computer science background. A lot of psychologists say that we can rely on our intuitions, but we need to put them through a little bit of a debugging process. We need to kind of examine our intuitions in a little more detail to make sure they're not leading us down a sort of a wrong path. And sometimes we need to unlearn bad intuitions and sort of improve upon them, okay? Okay, so let's speed up this process a little bit. So we only have just under 10 minutes left. So in a lot of concepts, like physics is a good example. There are things in physics like the concept of quantum mechanics that are actually considered very much counterintuitive, okay? There's a good statement that was once made about quantum physics. It's, if you think you know quantum physics, okay? It's from Richard Feynman, who was a famous physicist, won the Nobel laureate in physics. Here it is. It's, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. That's his famous quote. It's this idea that our intuitions that we think we know something could be very, very much wrong, okay? Now I'll give a biology example. 200 years ago, it was intuitively obvious to biologists that everything in nature had a purpose and that everything evolved with a purpose in mind. But I don't think everyone agrees on that now, right? There are some things that have evolved in biology for just weird and unexplained reasons, okay? That there isn't necessarily a goal in mind. A good example, if you ever want to use for an essay or something like that, is there's an interesting blood vessel in a giraffe that has evolved in a very strange way. And we obviously know about a giraffe as the really long neck. And there's this really weird blood vessel that goes all the way up the neck and then all the way back down. And it seems like it is actually a very inefficient system for getting blood back and forth through this giraffe. And obviously, if it was evolving to be the best case outcome, it probably wouldn't have done that. So the biologists who study and the zoologists who study giraffes don't really know why this blood vessel does this. It's essentially just this weird side effect of the evolution of the giraffe. So I think biologists don't agree now that everything has evolved with a specific purpose in mind. Okay. Then, of course, we can get into even more higher level discussions like ethics. How does intuition affect ethics, right? For centuries, people would argue that it was obvious that men were superior to women, and entire societies and law systems were built on that assumption. And that certain cultures and certain races, and race is a weird word because it's a social construct word, were, inferior to other races. So all of that is problematic when we look at it now. But at the time in the society, one could argue that those were intuitively obvious. So that's a good challenge for what intuition could mean as well, right? Is intuition an evolving sort of concept that we need to really examine? Finally, let's look at these social intuitions. How do we interact with other people? We tend to be overconfident in our social intuitions. We tend to say, I'm a really good judge of people, when in reality, we're maybe not as good a judge of people as we think, okay? They've actually done countless experiments about that, where people say, I'm a really good judge of character. Or we have those people who claim they're really good at detecting lies. But in fact, what most studies show is that they're not. People aren't as good at judging other people as we think we are, because people are really good at hiding stuff. Okay, the final piece, natural and educated intuitions. We've already kind of talked about this a little bit. Intuitions can be considered core or natural, and then we can talk about these so-called educated or subject-specific intuitions. But what if you wanted to say someone is an expert at intuition, like someone who's a chess grandmaster, who can look over a chessboard and just have a good intuition of what is a good move versus what is a bad move? Is that just raw intuition? Is that something they've trained themselves to do? Let's dig into that a little bit. What about people in other areas like biology or stocks or baseball? A lot of our so-called historical breakthroughs may have come through these flashes of intuition, like the Archimedes example I started this presentation with. Typically, what those really are is someone who's been working and thinking about a problem for a really long time. And then that aha moment is the result of the person's brain working through the problem for a tremendous amount of time. You could use a simple example from your own life. Maybe you are thinking of this person from a movie that one time and you don't, what's that actor's name? I don't remember the actor's name. He was in that movie, and you ask your friends and they're like, I don't know who you're talking about. And you keep thinking about it. And then all of a sudden, the next day when you're eating dinner, you're like, aha, I know who that guy was. And then you say his name. Is that aha moment just this weird flash of intuition just because of no reason? Of course not. It's because your brain had been working on that problem for a long time, okay? That maybe intuition is the result of your brain's processes and the way it kind of goes through. So maybe don't think of intuition as this shortcut where we can all of a sudden know something through this sort of aha moment, and it's this sort of effortless way to come up with knowledge, but that it's the result of a thorough understanding of the problem that you were examining, which could be within a specific area, or it's and it's the result of your brain working on that problem for a fair amount of time. You actually put the effort in to think about it. So how reliable is intuition? How good is it? Is it something we should use? I think it is. I think intuition is definitely a good thing to use, but we have to, like we did in everything in this course, examine it in a much more sort of specific way, okay? We should test our intuition with our other areas of knowledge, our other sources of knowledge. Do we trust it? Could we be wrong? Keep asking ourselves that question. What if we have contradictions between reason and intuition? then which one should we go with, right? And how should we balance those out? What about emotion? Should emotion be a balancing piece? Should we so-called use the head versus the heart, right? So if we use intuition as a sort of a companion piece to emotion, don't look at it as an obstacle to knowledge, but another piece of your problem-solving sort of process to get through sort of your own questioning as to what this knowledge could be. Okay, so speeding up the end of this presentation, looking at the 4 ways of knowing: reason, perception, language, and emotion, and now putting in intuition as another way of knowing, okay, as a companion to those ways of knowing. It really, I think, can help you kind of use this as a piece or a tool for some of your other stuff, like your essay. Okay. Woo! 9:46. I timed that out pretty well. Thank you for everybody who stayed on the line. I'm going to wrap it up now for you guys. That's it for me for today. I'm going to see you guys again on Thursday. And on Thursday, we won't have as much intro to this, but I'll just sort of dive into another thing, and hopefully we can get something a little more interactive. And if not, I'm going to see you guys back in class for extra activities on Monday. Okay, I'm going to stay on Teams if anyone has any questions or want to talk to me. But if you don't have any questions or don't need to talk about anything with me, have a great day, you guys, and I'll see you on Thursday.